So excuse me, we need to get started. We're at 31 past and we've got a tight agenda today, so let's get started. So I'm really pleased to be at the second of our climate change action committees. We are running a hybrid meeting with the COVID-19 situation, unfortunately, and so we don't have public in the gallery, but there is a setup so the public can be present outside of the room and watching online. When we have, and the meeting's being recorded and that will go on our website later. So we will also have, when the speakers come in, we all need to put our masks on, and then the speakers will give their presentation. And when we're through, we've got one public forum and 2 deputations this morning. And so when those are through, then we can take the masks off the remainder of the meeting. So I'll just make sure we stick with that. We do have a quorum present, and so we will start the meeting now. The meeting's open. So Ian, would you like to do mihi and
tēnā koe, wiki nei te mea ati kia koe, e whakahaere tēnei hui, tēnei rara, noreira, tēnā koe kōrua kōlas, koutou, ngā kaikauni hira, nei te mea ati kia koutou, ka tīmatanga te tau parapara, whai muri tērā, ka mahi te mahi noreira. Ko tēnei te ruru, te kaukau mai nei ki hai mā, hititi ki hai mā, raka tūpoka nui o te ruru, te reko. Hepo, he ao kawa tia ti hei wā, mauri ora. Nei te mihi hoki kia Nicole, nānei whakatūwhera te rānei, e tuku karakia, mua wai, mō tātou katoa, nā reira tēnā koe Nicole. Koutou hoki, ngā manuhiri ki te haramai i tēnei rā, ki te kaunere taio ki Waitaha, kia Sam rau ko Hunter, ko Jeff, Faye and Francis, nei te mihi kia koutou, pai ki te koutou ki te haramai i tēnei rā, just acknowledging our deputations and our coming in today from Sam and Hunter, Jeff, Faye and Francis to have our manuhiri come to talk to us about issues pertinent to our environment and to climate change. We mihi to you. Also, he rā maumahara i tēnei rā, ko te rā te kaumatahi, o te marama te kaumatahi, and then hei te kaumatahi karaka, ka maumahara tātou katoa, i a rātou i whawhai i te pakanga tuatahi o te ao, just remembering it's Remembrance Day at the 11th hour, just reflect on those who fought in the First World War for the Commonwealth, and then making sure we don't forget and we remember them. Kia ora tātou. Kia ora Vicky. Nei te wā.
Thank you. So can I ask, well, we have no apologies that I'm aware of. Does anyone got any apologies? No. Oh, Chair Huey's not here. Is she? Oh, is she online? No. Okay, so we'll take apologies from Chair Huey. And Councillor Hands, of course, Councillor Hands on maternity leave. Any conflicts of interest? No. So we have then the public forums deputation. So our first will be from, I'll perhaps wait for them to come in the room, but right, we need to put masks on, so I'm forgetting my own rules. It's easily done. So we can empathise with the speakers because it's actually really hard to talk with the mask on. I find it quite hard. Hopefully those online can hear well enough. So we have Sam, Nethercliffe and Hunter. So I'm struggling to read this. Heather's Bayak. So Sam and Hunter are from University of Canterbury, and have you graduated now? Is this the end of your, I think this might be the end of their, yeah, so the third year graduates on the geography, who took in a geography 309 project as part of a team, and we're looking particularly at how to communicate climate change climate change with young people. And so this is something that's really important to us for informing our It's Time Canterbury campaign. Often young people, for whatever reason, don't hear, aren't always engaged in what we're talking about around these sorts of tables. And sometimes we just don't actually know what they're thinking. And so it's obviously really important to understand more. So if I could ask you both, you can press the red button, I'll turn mine off. And then the way it'll work, you'll have 10 minutes to give a presentation. There'll be a signal, a bell at 9 minutes, which just means you need to be wrapping up. And then there'll be some questions from the floor. So when you're ready, then we can start. Thank you.
So tēnā koutou katoa, I'm Sam and this is Hunter. And we represent a group of 5 undergrad students from UC. And we're doing a geography course in which we engage with a community partner to help solve real world issues. Our tutor was Dr. Kate Prendergast, who is a postdoctoral fellow at UC. And our community partner was Rachel Young from here at ECAM. And she introduced us to your campaign, It's Time Canterbury, and then to our topic, which was engaging with young people on climate change.
Rachel introduced us to Fiona Shannon and Chelsea Hallowell as the spokespeople for the campaign It's Time Canterbury. Together they explained the complex issue of climate change and highlighted the challenges of youth engagement. Our research hoped to fit into the It's Time Canterbury campaign and ultimately help encourage climate-friendly behaviour among young people.
So our research question was to find out what the key messages and mechanisms are that encourage young people to be more climate active. And that's young people aged between 17 and 25.
So we split our research into 5 interconnected key sub-themes, which we explored in our literature reviews. These were environmental psychology, the social and group norms that drive collective action, the different languages, narratives, and techniques used to engage youth on climate change, how role models and campaigns can be used to engage youth, past youth motivations for climate action, and youth presence on social media.
So from our research question and those literature reviews, we decided to focus on 3 main objectives. The first was to understand how social media can be used as a mechanism to engage young people in climate active behaviour. The second was to understand how identities can engage young people with climate change. And the third was to understand how narratives and language techniques can engage young people in climate change.
This was our approach to the research. Since we hope to include rangatahi Māori student perspectives in our research, we went through the Ngāi Tahu consultation and engagement group process. Once that was completed, we created a survey on Qualtrics, which we piloted before using convenience and snowball sampling to distribute. And through these methods, we managed to receive 176 responses with representation from a variety of ages, ethnicities, and from students and non-students/workers. We also did 3 semi-structured interview style focus groups, 2 worker and 1 student focus group. These used convenience sampling techniques to recruit the participants. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we could no longer undertake the Rangatahi Māori focus group. We analysed our survey data by looking at proportions, count values, and chi-squared analysis. And we analysed our focus group data by looking for specific themes throughout the discussions. And based on these results, we made recommendations to ECAN.
So relating to the first objective we had, these are the key results related to media platforms. Instagram was ranked the most used platform for young people in our sample, with an average of 3.06 on a ranking scale between 1 and 5, with 5 being the most used. This was followed by Snapchat with 2.47, Facebook with 2.09, and YouTube with 2.07, which was an avenue that It's Time Canterbury wanted to utilise.
Next, we looked into the type of content on these platforms that would be most engaging. We found that short media clips under 1 minute were most popular, with just over 40% of our sample selecting this as the most engaging. This was followed by long video clips over a minute at 18.3%, and then Instagram stories with 14.3%.
These quotes were obtained from the tertiary student focus group, and they went on to explain how, with the typical attention span of youth, content needs to be quick and attention-grabbing to leave a lasting impact.
These were the key results for identities and groups, since the second objective was to understand how identities can engage young people with climate change. To approach this, we asked our participants to select how important certain identities were to them. 64% of participants rated being a New Zealander as important or very important to their identity. This relates to the importance of collective action, and it's interesting that young people tend to identify most with being a Kiwi. Political affiliation was the next most significant, with about 30% of young people saying that this was very important or important to them.
To deepen our understanding of identities, we followed up with the question, how likely is it that the following groups will influence you to join activities to protect the environment? Again, the influence of other New Zealanders was the highest at a cumulative effect of likely and very likely of 68.8%. This was followed by Cantabrians at 53.2%. The influence that other Cantabrians can have on young people was a bit surprising because, as shown on the previous slide, only 20.7% of young people thought that being a Cantabrian was important for their identity.
So here's the narrative key results, since our third objective was to understand how narratives and language techniques can engage young people in climate change. Climate change narratives can alter the way that climate change is represented and perceived. If messages are framed in a way that appeals to young people, then this might produce more widespread support. In our survey, we questioned young people on what narratives would be most engaging. Our results show that the most popular narrative was a persuasive and factual approach. This narrative revolves around using statistics and facts. The two next most popular narratives were the here and now approach and the social justice approach. The here and now approach would use direct statements. The social justice approach, in terms of the social justice approach, our literature reviews indicated that framing climate change from this perspective would draw on young people's emotions. This includes stats and facts that show the impact of climate change on communities.
So the specific narratives from the previous slide are backed up with more general ideas about how climate change content should be presented. The most popular presentation of climate content was seeing people's documented climate actions, and this was followed by positive and inspirational messages. So ultimately, these results show that the messages which young people find most engaging are messages framed in a persuasive and factual lens, but with examples of people doing positive climate actions in the community.
Our focus group data showed similar responses to narratives. Although instead of the persuasive and factual approach, one participant of the worker focus group thought that the here and now approach was most engaging because it can be short and sweet. In response to what would you like to see in terms of social media content, one participant said, small reminders that climate change is still happening. We confirmed that this meant in the form of happy, bright, encouraging reminders. This backs up what we said on the previous slide about how climate change should be presented, i.e. documented and positive climate actions in the community.
We did identify some limitations throughout this process. So as mentioned earlier, our sampling method was convenient sampling. And because of that, our results should be interpreted with a bit of caution because they may not be transferable and fully represent the perspectives of Canterbury youth. This is relevant for the survey and the focus groups because we were limited to the perspectives of our contacts and peers who may share similar experiences with us. Another limitation was time constraints, and it meant that we couldn't hold our Rangatahi Māori focus group. We are grateful to have been able to hear Rangatahi Māori voices in the survey, but the lack of a focus group is a major limitation.
So here are our recommendations that we've come up with. Our first three of those recommendations also draw on chi-squared analysis of the narratives and what social media content was most engaging. We recommend to ECAN to use lots of Instagram and that short videos should promote small tasks to encourage environmentally friendly behavioural change using the everyday concerns narrative. Moreover, we recommend using the here and now approach on Facebook. When using YouTube, long videos should opt to use a persuasive and factual approach or a social justice approach. We also recommend using young New Zealanders and Cantabrians to encourage climate active behaviour, as it is relatable, since young people can see similarities between themselves and the role models. Here's a couple of examples of possible Instagram posts that we've come up with. The example on the left incorporates an image of a student of the target age range engaging in climate-friendly activity, cycling. On the right, a simple cartoon. There's minimal text, and they're both local examples in Christchurch.
From our results, we can suggest some further research. In terms of data collection, we'd advise targeting non-workers, rangatahi Māori, and people in the wider Canterbury region. It may also be a good idea to get a nationwide perspective for increased transferability. Another suggestion would be to begin trialling our findings in the form of social media content as shown on the previous slide.
We'd like to finish off by thanking our community partner, Rachel, as well as Fiona and Chelsea for introducing us to this project and giving us support and opportunity. This concludes our presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
I've got one from Lan and then Peter. Thank you.
Oh, kia ora kouroa. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I really learned a lot. My question was really about the here and now. And noting that you're recommending that for Facebook. Is that like, where does sort of like live, does that refer to like more like live videos or sort of like things that are happening today? Or do you just want to expand a bit on that? Thank you. Yes, you do.
Okay. So the here and now approach it kind of refers to just direct statements like climate change is happening, Aotearoa, this is what you can do. It's just really kind of stressing the urgency, I guess. And so you could combine that with things that people are doing in the community just to emphasize that. And yeah.
Thank you. And Peter?
Hey, thanks for that, and thanks for it's pretty wide coverage you give us in terms of social media. My question is this to you: so, how do we identify role models that you would identify too, in terms of some of the things that you're talking about?
Right. So yeah, the main thing with the role models that we found from the survey and focus groups is mainly just people around the age group that we're looking at. Doesn't necessarily have to be. It doesn't really matter who it is, just maybe like if you're targeting university students, a university student doing something in the community or an athlete or something like that. But yeah, the age is the most important and that they're from Canterbury.
And again, just to dig a little bit further into that, so role models, I mean, the cliche role models are, sports people or skateboarders or whatever. So what are you saying there? Are you saying that just any university student with a passion for something can be used as a role model in terms of, or does it have to be a recognizable? Does it have to be a recognizable person?
It doesn't have to be a recognizable person. Yeah, we just found that people relate to people their own age from the same area. And yeah, it doesn't specifically have to be like an athlete or anything, just doing something climate friendly or
Yeah, something inspirational, I guess.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. What I'll do is share their report. I had received your report yesterday, so I'll share it with councillors, and I'm sure Taflin, who leads on our comms and our It's Time Canterbury campaign, people will really will have got lots and lots out of this. It's fantastic. Thank you ever so much. So I'd just like to recommend that the Climate Change Action Committee receives the public forum from Sam Nethercliffe and Hunter Pethersbach, both Canterbury University students on their research project with Environment Canterbury Senior Leader Communications and Engagement in regards to ways to engage with young people on climate change. So can I have a mover? So Lan to move, seconder please. Grant, Councillors Farm and Councillor Edge. So those who are in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against? No one, so that's carried. Thank you very much. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have we now have take a quick breath if anyone wants a quick breath. And then we'll go back in. We have two deputations now, so Yeah, I'm struggling because I'm missing up. Yeah. Right. Okay, so we'll get back on. We've got a presentation from Jeff Smith, who I'll welcome in a moment. Yeah. Yeah, sure, Jeff. You're welcome to make yourself comfortable and give your presentation however you prefer. And you can see the screen from where you're sitting on the big screen. So you're welcome to walk as long as the button's on and you stay within maybe a meter. Okay. So the way the buttons work, just to say that when you press the button, it'll go red, and then the people who are online will be able to hear you as well as hearing the room. But I can capture your button as well. So I'll press it when I press mine. So if you press now, I would, and then and then you can take it. So Jeff is from DETA Consulting and is an expert in decarbonisation pathways. I watched a couple of webinars that DETA Consulting ran during our very first lockdown. And so for me, that was really interesting. You know, what are the practical ways that we can reduce our carbon emissions imminently? You know, it's great to have all these long-term ways of doing things, but actually what can we do now? So Jeff's bringing this deputation to us, which is speaking to our submission that we're developing in respect to the emissions reduction plan. So Jeff, you've got 10 minutes to speak, and okay. You'll hear a little tap on the glass at 9 minutes.
Sweet as, okay. I timed myself last night, it was 10 minutes 20, so I'll be real quick. Hey, thank you for having me. So as Vicky said, my name is Jeff, I'm from DETA. What I do essentially is work alongside industry to help them decarbonise. I also, I guess in my personal time, try and work alongside business groups such as the Climate Leaders Coalition, hopefully you know who they are, and the Sustainable Business Council to advise on their submissions to documents such as the Emissions Reduction Plan. There's a link at the bottom if you're bored around some work we've done previously around a briefing document to government, and essentially that outlines how the government can reduce emissions by a certain portion and assigns real budgets to it. So we're trying to connect, I guess, the potential with the real action, and we do that through mechanisms with business. And I guess if I could frame this conversation up very slightly, I'm sure you know that the ERP is out. That's quite a disappointing document in many ways, but I'm really here to talk about how ECAN and Canterbury can help to address the shortfall in the initial budget, which is 7.7 million tonnes over that 4-year period. What can we really do about it? And I'm going to propose that through what we're calling a zero coal Canterbury. And the role, I guess I'm here to talk about the role that I think ECAN can have in owning that. Frame things up a little bit. There was a document and stuff that came out the other day. They're doing some really cool climate stuff lately around the top polluters in the country. And I hope you were drawn towards a few of those, all of whom have major operations in Canterbury, such as Fonterra, Synlait Milk, Ravensdown, and a lot of meat processors. They have significant operations in Canterbury. You should know them because you are engaged with them, allowing them to burn the fuels that they burn to do the processing they need to do. And I know that you are looking at your own carbon footprint. ECAN's working pretty hard to look at your building, look at your fleet, having a bit of a think about what you can do for, I guess, to use terminology, your scope 1 and 2 emissions. I don't think you're doing enough in your scope 3 emissions, and hence the plan and the discussion today. In the Canterbury context, there are 70 active coal-consuming sites in Canterbury, and that's out of 366 in the South Island and about 1,100 across the country, so a significant portion. And the important thing from a Canterbury context is lots of those sites are really, really big, especially the ones in the dairy industry and in the meat and food industry. There's a good story though. So lots of those sites are already doing really good things. Down the road here at the hospital, there's some conversion happening. There's biomass boilers going in down there. There's biomass boilers already in Burwood Hospital. So some of the government agencies are doing some really good things. So it's not all a bad story. But simplistically, this isn't happening quickly enough to meet the climate needs that we have to achieve our targets. What does it look like? It's about 1 million tonnes a year of CO2. So you probably know we're about 79 million tonnes across New Zealand. It's quite a significant portion. So this is a meaningful piece. And just remember, at the start, I talked about the shortfall we have in our first budget is 7.7 million tonnes. If we can address this quickly, that can play a meaningful role in addressing that short-term view. Canterbury is the perfect spot to do more. So I don't know if you know this stuff, but obviously you're engaged very closely with the iwi, but we have a really engaged and savvy iwi who are doing wonderful things in the sustainability space. Perhaps not in the processing and coal space, but certainly in the ag space and even in the transport space. So nationally, I think that is a really positive role that Ngātahi can play alongside ECAN. We've got aspirational businesses, like I said, who are already walking the talk. They're doing some good things. I've talked about CDHB. Synlait down the road have invested in an electrode boiler, the first in the world at a dairy plant. They are taking risks to try and decarbonise. They're also investing in biomass on that site. They are doing wonderful things to try and move the barrow forward. In Christchurch, we are also the home of Meridian, the largest renewable energy provider in the country, and we also have the largest wood boiler manufacturer just over the hill here, Edmonton Engineering. It's all close to home. We have the expertise right here to make the change we need to do. And the other thing which I think is really important, we talk a lot about electrification. I don't know around your board table, but in my world we do. And we talk about the fact that Orion have done this before. There's going to be a massive need of investment in agencies like Orion. They want to make this investment. They want to make this change. And they've done it before with the repairs after the earthquake. They have done a huge amount of work, and they need to do a huge amount of work going forward to help businesses to react. And we have an ability to move quickly. I'm an engineer. I'm doing this because this is what I think is important. But there are many, many other engineers like me who have the knowledge, have the ability, and can move quickly. And the most important thing I think here to remember is around your board table, I'm sure you have discussions regularly about agriculture and transportation, which is key for what you guys need to talk about. But the reality is they will be long-term. They will contribute to our long-term reduction emissions. They will not contribute to the short-term. Process heat change can deliver quick, meaningful carbon reductions by ditching coal really quickly, much quicker than those other areas. And simplistically, it's inert from an electorate perspective. I don't care, or I don't think you care necessarily, if the chips you buy in the supermarket, if your milk powder, if your meat, if you're eating meat, if that comes from a coal processor or a diesel processor or an electrical processor, it doesn't matter, you just want your chips, right? So that's kind of irrelevant, and it doesn't affect people the same way the change in agriculture and the change in transport will. So it enables us to be quick about what we do, right? And we don't require as much time to bring people along on the journey with us. So what does it need? Here's my pitch to you and what I hope you'll take away from this. I think there's a role for ECAN to own the conversation with central government on behalf of Canterbury and request support to help businesses transition quickly. It's a lot of money, and so I live in a real world of money and business cases. The transition cost we think is around $800 million, so it's not a lot. It's not a lot. It's a huge amount of money, but that's the total cost. It's not the cost that we're necessarily looking for to solve. The government has funding already, which is going towards business, and we're finding about 30% of the total cost is what's really needed to grease the wheels and make projects happen quickly. And what is it, I guess, from a risk perspective, we've got to think about what our obligations are going to be should we have to offset our emissions long term. So today the carbon price is $65 a tonne. It's quite substantial. It's far ahead of what the Climate Change Commission expected it to be from their price pathways. So $150 a tonne in 2030 will mean for our region, we will have an additional obligation of about $150 million based on that 1 million tonnes emission. So quite substantial. And if we're talking about, say, 300 million, it's a 2-year payback, simplistically, for the region. We also think it needs positive partnership with industry. I work with lots of different businesses, and their impression of ECAN is not overly positive. They see it as you as a regulator, but I see this as a way to change the conversation for you to be a partner to work alongside them to decarbonise, rather than just being the person who goes and tells them not to burn as much of ABC or whatever it might be. And alongside that, testing alternatives of that stigma. So biomass, wood, and electricity are going to be 2 key areas that will, I guess, dominate the transition pathway. But there are other things like char and bio-oils and what have you that might require some flexibility in how consents are managed and handled. So working alongside business rather than being but living in the grey, let's call it living in the grey for a period of time, would be useful for a period of time to help industry have the confidence to actually do some of these things. And so I'm asking you to consider a zero coal Canterbury plan as part of your ERP submission. To close out, I'd like you to be bold. This is quite bold thinking. I think it's different for the thinking that you possibly have normally. But bringing it back to the climate emergency piece, we as a country, you as a committee have declared a climate emergency a number of years ago. This allows you to create change on a shorter term scale than you might already be thinking. And I want you to remember that your reach is wider than this building. So I'd like to ask you to reach there. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jeff. And now questions. So Peter, sorry, Councillor Scott. Questions.
Hey, look, thanks for this, and I admire your faith in us. I really do. My question is around the supply chain logistics around biomass in terms of that. I mean, we're going to flick all these guys out into the biomass. Where does that come from?
Good question. So we currently doing the transfer.
Sorry.
We're currently doing some work alongside Transpower and ECA as well as EDBs to assess what that market looks like. The reality is there's not going to be enough biomass for everybody, certainly not at the price points we're expecting. But when I talk about that price point, as the carbon price increases, it becomes far more competitive to use alternative non-slash timber to make this to be the alternative fuel. The reality is we're going to rely on electrification a lot more, and so that's where the focus for New Zealand will likely go. Yes.
Yeah, follow.
So a fast transition to biomass, would that mean that we would be importing biomass?
Getting used to this. No, we wouldn't be importing biomass. There will be a limited amount of biomass that we have as a country, and the rest of us, I guess, in terms of process heat or same as transportation, we will have to electrify.
Thank you. Thank you. So Councillor Clearwater.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I just wanted to ask you about your costings for that transition plan, and you said 800 million. So, like, for example, a couple of questions. One is, does that plan include, for example, a transport plan in terms of public transport? I just wondered if it might. But also just if it, why should, I'm not sure why it doesn't. Yeah.
Cool. Good question. So I live in the space around process heat industry, and so that's what I've come and presented on today, which is, I guess, my area of expertise. The point I made earlier on was around the fact that process heat is we can make the change quicker than we can potentially with transportation. I think part of the challenge with transportation is you're requiring the masses to come along the journey with you. You don't have that with process heat. You can do that tomorrow using I guess, financial mechanisms to incentivize industry to make that transition. I see it a little different with transport, and I think there's going to be a longer term process to bring everybody online to buy into that long term decarb piece.
So today you've mainly been talking about short term ones, really. And thank you for clarifying that.
Sorry, yeah, I want to. So in the emissions reduction plan for the first budget, which runs from January 22 till December 25. We are 7.7 million tonnes short, according to the emissions reduction plan. Even in the paper today, there was a discussion around credits of up to 150 million credits. I can't remember what the dollars are. I read the paper in bed this morning. But simplistically, I'm looking for a solution. I'm proposing a solution which will help us to meet our obligations internally rather than sending that money offshore.
Councillor Farm.
Thank you so much, Jeff. This is really fantastically specific, and I think we appreciate that in terms of our submission and being able to really discuss this. My question is around picking up as well on the 800 million transition cost. And it's helpful that that's total cost. Do you have a broad view about, because you've been working with industry in these types of scenarios, how much you would expect to come of that from industry versus how much would be the public purse, essentially?
Yes, I do. So recently, ECA has had a fund called the GIDI Fund, the GIDI, Government Investment in Decarbonising Industry. It was $70 million geared towards, and it was a competitive fund based on how the dollars per tonne of carbon saved versus the dollars invested. So essentially assessing the lowest capital cost for the most savings possible. All those numbers are available online through the ECA website. The range of cost in terms of dollars a tonne is sort of $10 to $13 a tonne. Remembering $65 is where our current carbon price is. So that industry is moving at a far lower price than our current obligation. So in terms of proportion, about 30 to 40% is what industry has needed. Some are less and some are slightly more, but that range of 30 to 40% would be the average required to help industry to make that transition.
Cool, thank you. And can I just do a quick follow-up? So you see us more ECAN's role in terms of the immediacy of this, in terms of holding that conversation rather than being following up in the regulatory space, or do you think that's part of the package?
I don't think you necessarily want to play in the regulatory space. I think you want to be a partner to business, and I think you could be a conduit for government to help them solve this short-term problem by being a local partner and using Canterbury as the example, and then that technology and that learning can roll out across the country. But I think the immediacy around this initial budget is super important. So that's the push.
Councillor Mackay. Oh, and
Thank you. Just a question of clarity around your third slide, which you've used of the stuff slide there and the figures on the right hand side. Are you suggesting that that is the coal burning emissions from those particular industries?
Button, Jeff.
Great question. No, I'm not. No. So I can't talk specifics because I work with these clients and I'm under an NDA for many of them. But simplistically, the emissions from the coal burning is around about 10% of the overall emissions for and the rest comes from agriculture. Yeah.
And Councillor Tunkel.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the presentation. It kind of aligns with what I've read, and so I don't see this as a short-term gain. It's an early gain, which then transitions. So if we are looking at the reduction of coal and the like, so taking those early opportunities, locking them in, and then working through the trickier and more long-term, whether it's transport, agriculture, and the like. So I just really appreciate the presentation.
And I'd just like to ask a question myself, if that's all right. In terms of the $70 million from the Giddy Fund, that was like a carrot that was available to support companies and the process, and they ensured that it was going for the most efficient gains financially in terms of carbon reduction. Is there also a need for funding, like for access to borrowing, to lending at favourable rates and that type of thing? Would that be something that would also be worthwhile considering?
Possibly. There are a number of financial institutions who are lending sustainable finance, which offers a substantial reduction on the market rate. So there are lending mechanisms like that. I guess the challenge is that even if you're taking that lending, it appears on your balance sheet, and that limits what other, I guess, projects that some of these businesses can do. So I think there'd have to be a different commercial model, but I think that's where the grants can come in to really kind of push them down a particular path. But again, from a grant perspective, I think the benefits to New Zealand Inc. are substantially more than what the grant contribution would be.
That makes sense. Oh, and then Councillor Edge.
So just a query about your comment on electrification. Are you helping people, or are people interested in alternative renewable energy, such as solar farms and wind farms? Is that something that enters into the mind of the people you're working with?
Yes, it does. The major challenge with that is the energy density of some of these sites. So if we're talking about, one of those large dairy sites you might drive past every day, there's 40 megawatts of thermal energy sucked in there. So in terms of megawatts, that is a huge density of energy in a small space. So the solar piece doesn't really solve that. They need more. Yeah, more density, I guess. Solar is just not the right solution for that. And the other piece is that they're 24/7, and so solar will provide energy during the day, but not provide energy during the night. Look, I'm not an electricity industry expert, but that's the reason why there's discussion around Onslow and the need for additional storage and additional for more hydro, and I guess the dry year risk piece. Solar and wind doesn't really solve that.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, and lots of great questions as well. So really, really appreciate that.
Cool. Thank you for having me.
I'll just move the wrong bit here. Hang on. On my page. So I'd just like to move recommendation that the Climate Change Action Committee receives the deputation from Jeff Smith regarding agenda item 7.2, transitioning to a low emissions and climate resilient future, emissions reduction plan discussion document. So do I have a mover? So Councillor Scott and a seconder, Councillor Clearwater. So can all those in favour say aye? Aye. Any against? No, so that's carried. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Much appreciated.
Real good. Okay, thank you. So I'd like to welcome Fred Borrens and Francis Johnson from Extinction Rebellion, who are also speaking to our item 7.2 on transitioning to low emissions future. Faye, Francis, you have a 10-minute slot for giving a presentation. There'll be a little tap on a glass at 9 minutes, just so you know when you need to be wrapping up. Really appreciate you coming in today and giving your time. And so if you'd like to make a start, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Faye Borrens and this is Francis Johnson. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning, providing input to your submission on the government's emission reduction plan. Extinction Rebellion Ōtautahi wish to acknowledge the work of the people here at Environment Canterbury to improve community connections. We support your vision for a thriving and resilient Canterbury now and for future generations. Toi tū te marae o tāne, toi tū te marae o Tangaroa, toi tū te iwi. And it's been fantastic to be speakers number 3 with amazing presentations coming before us. That's, feeling quite energising.
Great. Before making a submission on the government's emission reduction plan, it's first necessary to confront a contradiction that is there at the heart of that document. There's a wild discrepancy in the plan between its stated vision, its purpose, and its targets. All of these are on page 18. Their vision is for a thriving, sustainable communities that are good for people and function within planetary limits. Well, we wholeheartedly agree with that. Its purpose statement is to contribute to the global effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This is pretty good too. We do point out, though, that that it needs to be made clear what contribute means, because Aotearoa is a wealthy country. We're better able to afford to make. We're better able to afford emissions reductions than a lot of other countries, and to a large part, our wealth is a result of our past emissions. So it's only fair that our per capita emissions are much greater than the world average. It's also the IPCC, it tells us that a 1.5 degree world would be much worse than the world is today. So that 1.5 should be seen as a worst case. We should be trying to aim for as far below that as we possibly can. So given that, now let's look at the target of the ERP. That is to reduce long-lived gases to net zero by 2050 and reduce biogenic methane by 24 to 47%, also by 2050. Now, of course, these are the same as the target in the Zero Carbon Act. But this is at odds with their stated vision. This won't allow communities to thrive, and nor is it enough to keep the Earth's warming below 1.5 degrees. So we urge ECAN to support ERP's vision and purpose. Much of the ERP document is about how to meet a target that is woefully inadequate. So in order to be aligned with their vision and purpose, the targets need to be much more ambitious. So we call for net zero overall greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 and a large reduction in methane emissions. Meeting these is ambitious, but it is also necessary. And it is not possible with business as usual approach taken by the ERP. there needs to be a much greater sense of urgency and much more emphasis on behaviour change. To meet the ERP's vision of sustainable communities, it is not enough merely to increment what we do now. It is necessary to envision what radically different communities would be like and then to plan for them. So I'll now outline what our vision of that might be like. Firstly, on the economy. The current economy is destroying the environment while failing to meet the basic needs of many people. Changing this means adopting a mindset of an economy of enough that prioritises meeting everyone's needs, including basic needs such as healthy food, clean water, secure and affordable housing, affordable transport and quality education. It means reducing housing inequality. It means valuing the caring, creative and teaching professions much more than we do. These are generally low emissions and well-being enhancing. And it means supporting workers to transition from unsustainable occupations. On transport and energy, we urge you to support phasing out most fossil fuel use by 2025 and all of it by 2030. And this includes taking responsibility for emissions occurring beyond our borders. So therefore, we should redirect all investments to be consistent with that, with a zero carbon future. This means that active transport and low emissions public transport will be funded. New roads and airport extensions are not compatible with their future and should not, therefore, not receive funding. The ERP relies much too much on EVs. These are sometimes called zero emission vehicles, but they're not zero emissions if you take into account the emissions that went into their manufacture and transport. And there's other sustainable issues with them as well. So transitioning the fleet to from ICE cars to EVs can only be a small part of the solution. There needs to be a lot less travel overall. And part of that is planning where we live, work and play to minimise the need for travel and freight. Coal, oil and gas exploration and export need to stop as soon as possible. We need to accept that there will be far less international tourism and trade, and plan for that. About food supply, preventing future hunger is basic, but is very important to protect our growing land and our waterways. By these measures, intensive dairying in Canterbury is a disaster. It is degrading the soil, contaminating fresh water, contributing to climate change. Indeed, about 2/3 of Canterbury's emissions are from agriculture. Intensive dairying is life-threatening now and into the future. The ERP, however, relies on technological solutions such as methane inhibitors and methane vaccines, but these won't produce the depth of emissions reductions that are needed and won't solve the other environmental issues. A solution consistent with the ERP's own vision would greatly reduce intensive dairying and hence the total number of cows. And this is, in fact, a way of producing results quite quickly. It would phase out synthetic fertilizers, provide much greater support for farmers and other food providers to transition to sustainable practices. And it would increase food security through a diversity of crops to guard against uncertain future due to changed climate conditions.
I'm going to carry on from there. We believe it's vital to protect our natural ecosystems. Degradation of ecosystems is a major contributor to climate change, and so should feature prominently in the emissions reduction plan. To meet the vision of the ERP, laws must be changed to empower regional councils, such as Environment Canterbury, to protect natural environments as important in their own right and for their connections to the balance of life. We also think decision making is really important. Inclusive decision making. The transition to a zero emission sustainable Aotearoa must be just, inclusive and united. It's vital to uplift Indigenous voices. The ERP process must be conducted as a genuine partnership between tangata whenua and the government. A just transition should allow people in all areas of society to feel secure that they will have the necessities of life. Democratic decision-making must represent the interests of the ordinary people rather than corporate interests. Communication is a big part of how this is all going to come together. And so it was great to see the young people here this morning. Good public understanding is vital if people are to unite behind the programme of urgent radical change that is necessary. Therefore, the ERP must include provision for central, regional and local government bodies to keep the public well informed. They must communicate the magnitude and nature of the crises, and so the public understands the necessity for change. This includes emphasising the impact here and now, as well as the impact internationally and for people not yet born. It also entails explaining the importance of following the science, acknowledging uncertainties and the consequences of the full range of possible future scenarios. In conclusion, we are facing a grave crisis. Delaying taking action or taking half measures will make the effects of the crisis more severe than they need to be. However, we can come together in kindness and act boldly on science. We can save lives, honour and revitalise the ecosystem to which we belong. We can build an equitable society that gives all of us, tangata whenua, tauiwi and our descendants, the best chance to thrive long into the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. Do you have questions? Councillor Sunkel?
Thank you for that. I guess I'm a wee bit challenged. It sounds very urban centric and I live out in a rural space. So how do I travel and commute and some of those questions? But my real question is, we're looking for outcomes. Why would we, I guess, narrow it down to the removal of intensive agriculture when through innovation and technology we can achieve the same outcome? So my challenge is, if we can achieve the outcomes by whatever means, why would we not go there? Why would we just narrow ourselves to a position?
Thank you. With regard to transport, we have mentioned transport here, and it's obviously vital that we have transport for people, but rather than being individuals, maybe it's going to be more public transport. Yeah, systems have to be different than what they are now. Yeah.
With agriculture and transport, the measures that are proposed would reduce the emissions somewhat, but it's important to reduce them much more radically than the target set in the ERP in order to meet their stated vision, and that does require new approaches.
Thank you. And Councillor Farm?
Yeah, thanks so much for being here today and for giving your voices to for us to hear on our own submission on the ERP. I just wondered, in terms of taking action, if you had a view on what's included in the ERP, where quite a vast majority of New Zealand's action on climate change would be through buying international carbon credits, and do you have a view on whether we should be taking domestic action or whether it is that international big picture?
If you look at the problem from a global perspective, it's not possible for every country, and it would be quite unjust for high emitting countries to just palm off their emissions onto somebody else. So I think we have a moral obligation to reduce our own emissions. That said, being a wealthy country, if there's ways that we can assist other countries to reduce their emissions, then we should do that also. But it shouldn't be a substitute for us reducing our own emissions.
Thank you. We've got one short final question and we've got, we need to move on. So Councillor Scott.
Thank you. Thank you for coming in for this. Francis, when you were speaking, you said, and if I'm wrong here, tell me, okay, we need to take responsibility for emissions beyond our borders. So you talk about regional borders or national ones?
I was talking about
National borders.
Yes. Yeah, sorry, the microphone wasn't on. So yes, I was talking about national borders.
So I just want to be a bit more so in terms of the supply chain that gets stuff here, or responsibility for islands, or where's the risk?
Yeah, what I'm getting at is that our consumption is causing emissions. Some of those emissions are within New Zealand, and some of those emissions are outside New Zealand from manufacturing of things that we import and transportation of those. And ethically, I think we need to be taking responsibility for both.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. And it's really interesting to just hear how people feel about the future and what we're facing and how we might address these challenges that we do all recognise. So thank you ever so much for your time to come in and to speak to us. So I'd just like to move that we received a presentation and received a deputation from Faye Borans and Francis Johnson from Extinction Rebellion or Tutahi regarding agenda item 7.2, transitioning to a low emissions, climate resilient future emissions reduction plan discussion document. So can I have a mover, please? So Councillor Farm and a seconder, Councillor Edge. So all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. And anyone nay? Any nays? No. So the motion's carried. Thank you very much. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
So, right, we can take masks off now, and that's now going to be for the remainder of the meeting. We can keep masks off. So we have another presentation shortly. So we're, oh, hang on, I'm jumping ahead of myself. I've got minutes, haven't I? So we've got previous minutes from the last committee meeting, Climate Change Action Committee meeting, are on page 13 of your agenda. Hopefully they're the same in paper as they are in digital in terms of paper numbers, page numbers. So are there any matters of accuracy relating to the minutes that anyone would like to raise? This is from the meeting of the 12th of August, if you can remember back that far. So that's a no. So I'm going to propose or recommend that the committee confirms and adopts as true and correct record the minutes of the meeting held on the 12th of August 2021. So I can have a mover for those, please. Councillor Clearwater and a seconder. Councillor Scott, thank you very much. So all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Thank you. And those opposed? No one. So that's carried. We have
sorry, Councillor Southworth. Councillor Mackenzie has a question of matters arising from the minutes when that's appropriate.
Yes. Does that come later? Do it now. Okay. So yeah. So Councillor Mackenzie, would you like to speak, please?
Yes. I just wanted to follow up on item 5.1 in the minutes, which talks about appointing an independent member. My question to staff is, where are we at in terms of progress with that process?
So Tim Davey will speak to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Mackenzie. I'm just referring to the resolution, which is on page 16 of the minutes. And the resolution was that a recommendation that council approves a subgroup of councillors. Once that has been approved by councillors, we're ready to go.
So then we will be convening that subgroup, and staff have already worked through some ideas on how that could operate and what some of the processes are that are involved, and we're ready to go as soon as it has been approved by council.
So you're saying it hasn't been approved yet?
No, the minutes have not gone through to council yet, but they are on the agenda for the November 25th meeting, when we would expect, if they are approved, that then we can move forward with it.
So the subcommittee will be meeting prior to that, and we'll get the date in the diary.
So then we can move on the subgroup after that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we can set up a meeting, but yes, pending approval. And I'll just quickly add to that with if that's right, Chair. The second part of the resolution about the desired skills and knowledge. What we are working on a workshop which will be about what the climate change consideration is for governors, because it is a relatively new area for governance across the board, not just councils. We're wanting to bring in a specialist to talk to us about what are the requirements for you as governors under the climate change legislation, but also just general climate change considerations. We've got somebody that we're thinking of, and we're just starting to line that up, but unfortunately it won't be until the new year, but that's part of that second part of the resolution. Thank you.
So we're on track to have 2 appointed members by the next meeting? Is that what the intention is? Are we looking at that as a timeline?
We'll work on the timeline, but I think that we should be able to by the time of the next meeting of this committee, because it requires the council to approve and then the council to approve those members, but there is time before this next meeting of this committee to have that.
Okay, lovely. So we can perhaps note that that's an intention to go with that timeline. Thank you. So then moving on, we have now items for information, so part 7. And the first one, 7.1, is the IPCC 6th assessment report. And we have Fiona Shannon will speak to that. And then we'll be following quite quickly to a presentation by James Renwick, who's one of the authors of the IPCC report. So we're really privileged to have his time. Thank you.
Well, kia ora koutou. Thank you, Chair. The purpose of this paper is to share key messages from the IPCC's 6th assessment report on the physical science basis of climate change. And as the Chair has mentioned, we're very privileged to have joining us today Professor James Renwick. He's joining us virtually. Significant to have him speaking to this committee because he has been a lead author on the last 3 IPCC assessment reports. And so in the interests of time, I'll take the paper as read and move to introducing James. For those of you who don't know him, he is a nationally and internationally renowned climate scientist. He's an outstanding science communicator, having been awarded the Prime Minister's Science Communication Prize a couple of years ago. He's also the head of School of Geography, Environmental Sciences and Earth Sciences at Victoria University of Wellington, and he's a climate change commissioner. And in all of his spare time, he actually manages to do climate research himself. So thank you very much, James, for joining us, and I'll hand over to you now for your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona, and kia ora koutou. And thanks very much to Environment Canterbury and the Climate Change Action Committee for the opportunity to speak. Hey, would it be okay if I shared my screen? Because I've just made a few tweaks to my presentation while I've been listening in. It's not much different, but it's slightly different. I hope I can do that. Maybe not. If not, then I'll just go with the one you guys have got. Maybe that's the easiest thing to do, actually. So sorry about that.
If you can see your screen, James, there's a right near the big red button at the top right of your screen that says leave the meeting.
Yes, sure.
That little arrow thing.
Quite right. I know. Hang on, where are we here? Green.
Do you want to, Fiona?
Oh, okay. I think I'm getting there. Pardon that.
Yep. You're getting there.
Here we are. Okay. And I might just. So can everyone see my IPCC opening slide?
Yes, we've got that. Thank you.
Great. Excellent. Okay, here we go. So yeah, Fiona circulated the document that summarises some of the points from the recent report. And I'm really just going to go over fairly quickly some of the high points of that report that came out in August of this year. So some of the headlines, such as this first one, recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid and intensifying and unprecedented in thousands of years. I think that this has broadly been known for quite a while in the research community at least, but that word unprecedented really sets the tone for the report. There's just so much more certainty and more data, better models and so on. So we have, much less vague language in this report than we've had in previous ones, I would say. So just a graphic to support that statement, two time series plots. The one on the left, they're both for temperatures. The one on the left is global average temperatures over the last 2,000 years, reconstructed from tree rings and ice cores and so on. And then the observational record, the dark black line on the right-hand end, the last 150 years or so. And you can see the warming and how much warmer it is now than it has been for at least a couple of thousand years. And the grey bar on the left there is the range of sort of warmth over the last 100,000 years, the last glacial cycle. And we're up near the top of that for sure. And then zooming in to the observational record on the right, the dark black line is the observations showing the warming that really kicked in around the middle of last century. And the shaded regions are model simulations, climate model simulations. So you get the models follow the observations pretty well if you include when the volcanoes erupted, how bright the sun was, and how much greenhouse gas there was in the atmosphere. But if you don't include the information about the greenhouse gases, you get that green shading, which shows no warming at all in the last 60 or 70 years, in fact, a slight cooling. So this is strong evidence that it's greenhouse gas increase, which is due to human activity, that's causing the warming that we've been seeing, especially since about the mid-20th century. So just some statements taken out of the summary for policymakers. So global surface temperatures have increased faster in the last 50 years since 1970 than in any other 50-year period over at least the last 2,000 years. And that's stated with high confidence. It's probably a lot longer than 2,000 years, but we're really sure about that period. And each of the last 4 decades has been successively warmer than any decade that preceded it since 1850, which was the beginning of our observational record. So we're in uncharted territory for sure. Moving on to sea level and ice melt. Global mean sea level has risen faster since 1900, that's the last 120 years, than over any preceding century in at least the last 3,000 years. And sea level rise is increasing, the rate of rise is increasing all the time. 100 years ago, it was around 1 millimetre per year globally. We're up getting close to 4 millimetres per year now, that's 3.5, 3.6. And the loss of ice has increased over the last few decades as well. So ice sheet and glacier mass loss were the dominant contributors to global mean sea level rise during that period 2006 to 2018. And the rate of ice sheet loss has increased by a factor of 4 between the late 20th century, the late 1990s, and the most recent decade in the record used here. So yeah, loss of ice off the West Antarctic especially has increased really dramatically in the last couple of decades. And that kind of thing is what's driving this increase in the rate of sea level rise. So, summarising that, it's indisputable that human activities are causing climate change. And the way we feel it, I guess, is through making extreme events, heat waves, heavy rainfall, and so on, more frequent and more severe. You know, that's what really hurts us, and we see that around the world. I'll show some pictures of that in a minute. Just a couple of other headline statements, and this gets back to the conversation earlier with the Extinction Rebellion people and so on, and the plans that Environment Canterbury have. Unless there are immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be beyond reach. So the discussions in Glasgow the last couple of weeks, things are moving forward, but immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in emissions don't appear to be on the table quite yet. We're really talking about the sorts of things that are in the Zero Carbon Act, getting to net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050 and getting halfway there this decade. That's the important part, I think. Right now, we need to be acting immediately and getting to zero, basically, as fast as we can. And, you know, thinking about COVID, I would say going hard and going early is the motto. We haven't gone early. We should have been starting this 30 or 40 years ago, but better late than never, I would say. So when you look at the detail in the report, it says that unless there are almost miraculous changes in the next few years, 1.5 degrees of warming is pretty much guaranteed. We still have room to stop it below 2 degrees of warming, which would be an awful lot better than pushing beyond that. But yeah, I'd be pretty amazed if we did actually stop at 1.5 degrees at this point. And climate change is a problem that's affecting every region on Earth in multiple ways. It's not just about temperature change, it's all of the factors in the climate system. And this bottom sentence is important. The changes we experience will increase with further warming. There's no magic number, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, whatever. We just have to deal with the consequences. But the more warming, the more consequences and the harder it becomes to deal with. And at some point, in some areas, it just becomes unmanageable. So again, the sooner we can stop adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, the better. Just switching to some of the observed evidence, and this is a bit of a strange looking plot. It's a map of the world. Hopefully you recognise the Americas on the left and Africa and Eurasia in the middle. New Zealand's that little hexagon down in the bottom right corner. This is, the colours show what's happening with heat extremes. So the red tiles show areas where there's an increase in heat extremes, a statistically significant increase. And the shaded or hatched areas are where there's either not enough data or not really sure what's going on. There's nowhere where a decrease is indicated. So this country, like pretty much the whole of the rest of the world, is seeing increases in high temperature extremes. And that's the most obvious symptom of a warming climate, of course. It gets a bit more complicated with precipitation and either too much or too little heavy rainfall or drought. On the left, you can see the changes in heavy rainfall events. So the green colours show regions where there's a significant increase in heavy rainfall events, and it's across most of Eurasia and parts of both North and South America. But there's a lot of the world where it's still uncertain. There's either not enough data or the signals are mixed, and New Zealand falls under that category. The little bit I've clipped in on the right is for droughts, the frequency of agricultural and ecological droughts. And again, it's a bit of a mixed bag. And I think certainly for this country, rainfall, where it falls and how much falls, depends so much on local effects, on the topography, the location relative to the coast and all these things, unlike temperatures that are just much smoother and increase over broad regions. You see very mixed signals or plus lots of noise. You know, there's an awful lot of variability in these rainfall statistics. So this is probably going to be the case for this country for a good part of the rest of this century, depending on how much warming we get. Again, the more warming, the bigger change in the rainfall statistics, and the more likely it is that we'll see the effects in future. Okay, moving on to looking at the future and starting off with sea level rise. And there's been a slight change in the way this is presented in the sixth report. Up until recently was still the case. There's a lot of uncertainty around what happens with some of the instabilities with the ice shelves and the ice sheets, especially in Antarctica. Do we see water getting in under the ice shelves and running down under the ice sheets and lubricating big bits of ice? Do we see the ice cliffs on the edge of the ice shelves starting to shatter, and lots of ice flows into the water very quickly? That's what that dashed line is, the high sea level rise plot, the so-called low likelihood, high impact storyline. So the coloured shaded regions are what we're really sure about, I guess. Under all these different scenarios, the SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways, the bottom one, 1.9, is essentially the 1.5 degree world where we do stop emissions fast enough to get no more than 1.5 degrees. And the top one, the SSP 5, 8.5, is where we do the opposite, just burn more and more coal and so on, and warm the climate by 4 degrees this century. And amongst those scenarios, just the understanding of the ice sheets and glaciers and so on just keep doing what they've been doing so far, we still get quite a range of change in sea level. Compared to the middle of last century, we're talking about somewhere between 0.5 metre and getting on for 1 metre of sea level rise by the end of this century. But if these instability processes come into play soon in Antarctica and to a certain extent in Greenland, then we might get onto a much steeper path where we see more like 2 metres of sea level rise this century, or certainly 1.7, 1.8. And I think this is the scenario, what's close to the scenario NIWA used in their coastal hazards report a couple of years ago, the so-called RCP 8.5H+, I think. So it's possible. It's not likely this century. That's the general consideration. But if it did come to pass, we'd see much more rapid sea level rise for a long time into the future. And this is another feature of the report. It does look further into the future for sea level rise, at least. So this little set of bars on the right, it's hard to read the words, but the idea is this is looking another couple of hundred years into the future, 2300. And the blue bar shows the likely range for a strong mitigation scenario where we stop warming at less than 2 degrees this century, and the red bar is for the burn everything scenario. Even for the strong mitigation scenario, we're talking about a range between a bit less than 1 metre up to 3 metres in a couple of hundred years. And for the no mitigation, the opposite burn everything scenario, we're sitting between 2 and 7 metres, and the arrow at the top goes up to 15 metres, which couldn't be ruled out over the next couple of hundred years. So we might be baking in an awful lot of sea level rise. It will take a long time to come into play, but it's unstoppable, basically, which is the big worry. So just to hammer that a little more, there was another slide in the report showing the range of possible sea level rises over thousands of years. Maybe this is getting a wee bit esoteric for this audience, but even at 1.5 degrees of warming, if we stop the warming at 1.5 degrees, over thousands of years, we still can't rule out 6 or 7 metres of sea level rise. And of course, if we let things get really warm, well, the ice all melts eventually and we get tens of metres of sea level rise. Even at the low end of the range, what we're saying here is that extreme sea level events that occurred once per century in the recent past are projected to occur at least annually at more than half of all tide gauge locations by 2100. And that would include coastal regions of this country, of Canterbury, certainly. So even at the low end of the range, we're still talking about a huge increase in the chances of coastal inundation and the coastal erosion that goes along with that. Okay, one of the things that was produced as part of the report was the so-called fact sheets, and there's an Australasian fact sheet. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but you may be seeing it soon. This is just a snapshot of one of the figures from that. It shows changes in maximum and minimum temperatures, the two left columns, and total precipitation and maximum 1 day precipitation, so heavy rain, and the scale of the changes is shown at the bottom there. I guess the first thing, or the overriding thing to say about this is that Aotearoa is a pretty small country, and the detail is very hard to make out, and that's the case with this global scale report. The models are all, the results are all global, and it's hard to discern what this means regionally in this country. So NIWA are working on this now, and there'll be new downscaled local climate change scenarios coming out over the next few years, starting fairly soon, I think. But just broadly speaking, you can see that Australia, being a bigger landmass, warms faster than the global average. The figures are all the rows are for 1.5 degrees of global warming, 2 degrees and 4 degrees. So you see, especially Northern Australia, for minimum temperatures warming at maybe 30 or 40% more than the global average, and Southern Australia similarly for maximum temperatures. Meanwhile, this country is sitting at roughly the global average. We're pretty buffered by all the ocean around us. For precipitation, yeah, I won't say much because it really does depend on the local topography and where you're looking. So it's that annual total precipitation plot, not worth trying to discern much from that. But the maximum precipitation one tells a story that pretty much everywhere you look, you see an increase in the intensity of heavy rainfall events. So all of New Zealand's under that sort of 20 to 40% increase in the amount of rain that falls in a heavy rainfall event on a given day. And just a little box from that sheet. So the projected increases in rainfall, broadly speaking, we're still talking about the westerly winds becoming a bit stronger, especially in winter and spring. So broadly speaking, wetter in the west and south, especially in winter and spring, and drier in the east and north, also especially in winter and spring, and continuing melt of ice and snow in the Southern Alps. So I know that NIWA produced some new guidance for Canterbury last year, which goes into much more local detail and may not line up exactly with these kinds of rather broad scale statements. But just looking quickly at Christchurch or Canterbury, the projections, the overall picture is much the same now as it was in the previous fifth assessment report and in guidance from NIWA that's come through over the last several years, including the report from last year. So roughly speaking, by the middle of this century compared to the end of last century, so the 50-year change, temperature rise somewhere between 0.5 degree and 1.5 degrees, and that depends very much on what we do with emissions globally over the next 10 or 20 years. Overall, average precipitation not changing much, but extremes becoming more extreme at both ends, so longer dry periods, but also more heavy rain when it falls. And sea level rise somewhere between 20 and 30 centimetres by the middle of the century. And then by the end of the century, again, it's a very wide range of temperature rise, depending partly on where you're looking, but also how much more greenhouse gas goes into the atmosphere. Hopefully, we're going to be at the low end. The high end would be pretty devastating. Quite a lot of, when you look closely and you look at the latest NIWA report, there's a lot of seasonal variability and regional variability and average changes in precipitation. So I'll say no more about that. But again, more frequent and more intense droughts when it's dry and heavier rainfall events when it's wet. And sea level rise 50 to 100 centimetres. I think banking on a metre of sea level rise by the end of the century is probably a prudent thing, and thinking about getting up to nearly double that if these instabilities in the ice sheets start to come into play over the next couple of decades. And so this will have effects on water availability, on water storage, certainly on land use, so agriculture, what we can grow on the land, how much water there is to do that. And obviously coastal infrastructure, low-lying infrastructure near the coast is going to be significantly threatened as time goes on. And just before I wrap up, just put on my Climate Change Commission hat for a sec and just talk about one of the recommendations from the advice that was given to government at the end of May on aligning central and local government efforts. I know this has been an issue for many, many years, that local authorities have basically been left to get on with things by themselves, and there's been no national coordination and no real funding provided to allow councils to do what they need to do. So one of the things the Commission recommended was that there should be funding provided, and there should be thinking as we adapt the Resource Management Act and all the rest of it to having some kind of national plan for what's going on, so that all the individual councils can take some rather more coordinated effort. So, you know, there's been this consultation document, the emissions reduction plan, come out. I don't think there's much in there about this, but I really hope that we see government moving in this direction over the next 2 or 3 years. Anyway, just to wrap up, well, I guess we know climate is changing. Climate's changing faster now than it has been for a very long time. We know it's all down to human activity, which means we've got all the power to stop it. We just need to stop emitting greenhouse gases. And if Environment Canterbury can do it in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, well, great. The sooner the better. Everybody's affected by this, and many extremes are becoming much more common, and that's the real risk here. We need urgent reductions to stop warming even at less than 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. So that general outline that's in the Zero Carbon Act, halving emissions this decade and getting to zero by 2050 for carbon dioxide, but also reducing methane and other greenhouse gases as well, is what we need. Sea level rise is already locked in for many centuries into the future, but the big question is, can we cap the total level and the rate of sea level rise? It's something that we can manage to deal with as we go on. And again, this comes back to how quickly we can reduce emissions. Overall, the changes in climate over this country and sea level rise are close to the global average. And broadly speaking, the west is becoming a bit wetter, the east a bit drier, and extreme rainfall is becoming more intense. So this has impacts on everything we do, really: water availability, how we use our land, what we grow on it, and all around our coasts we're facing an increasing occurrence of coastal erosion and coastal flooding, and we really have to basically move away from that or find ways to protect ourselves from that. Okay, so thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation, and I shall stop sharing the screen. There we go. All right.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, James, for that presentation. That's really interesting and very succinct, given the depth of detail in the report. You've covered things really well. Thank you. We have some questions. First, Councillor Elizabeth Mackenzie, who's online. So it's going to be an online question to an online presenter. I'm hoping that's going to work. I'm assuming it will. So Liz, would you like to ask your question?
Yep, sure. Can you hear me, James?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I've got 2 questions.
Yep.
So my first question is about a recent paper that came out which modelled the effects of the Gulf Stream shutdown in the Northern Hemisphere. I don't know if you've seen it. How will the Southern Ocean circulation and the temperatures change down here in response to that shutdown and what that model had in it?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, first of all, I would say I know the paper you're talking about. The IPCC report looked into this, of course, and the overall consensus at the moment is that the Gulf Stream, or the whole overturning circulation in the Atlantic and around the Antarctic, it has been weakening lately, but it isn't expected to shut down this century. Not to say it won't at some stage, but it's not an imminent threat. But if it did happen, the modelling I've seen suggests that actually we would see increased warming in the Southern Hemisphere, that just the way the ocean transports heat around in the circulation, that the knock-on effect for us would be increased warming. But it would affect the climate over the whole globe. It would affect rainfall, storms. It would be hard to deal with, especially in the North Atlantic sector, so Western Europe and the eastern part of North America.
And it might affect the rate of ice sheet melting and things like that, perhaps, as well.
Yes, indeed. And this is one of the big concerns, that the ocean, not at the surface, but down at depth below the edge of the ice shelves, that's where it's warming the fastest in the Southern Ocean. And that is tied into the way the Gulf Stream and the Atlantic circulation is changing. So, yeah, some worries there.
Yeah. So my second question is, I think it was last year, we had a similar meeting, and I said every time the IPCC issues a report, the worst case scenario from the previous report ends up becoming the sort of actual scenario. And I was just looking at your graph there, where you've put a low likelihood, high impact line on the global mean sea level rise. And, I'm just wondering, by the time we see you again next year, what's the likelihood, given human nature, that graph, that steep graph, ends up being the actual?
That's another great question. Well, you mentioned human nature, and I have to say I've been fairly disappointed so far in what's happened in Glasgow. I mean, they're making progress, the steps forward being taken and so on, but we're not seeing the sort of response that we really need to see. Having said that, that scenario for the very rapid sea level rise, we know it's happened in the past, the geological past, coming out of ice ages and so on, but it is still considered to be low likelihood, and we have to wait probably 30 or 40 years to know whether it's actually coming to pass or not. The more warming we have, and the more ocean warming especially, the more likely it becomes. But at the moment, it is still considered to be unlikely. And I think if I came back in a year to talk again, I'd have no more information really. It is quite a slow process. Once it gets going, the rate of sea level rise does increase quite dramatically, but it will take decades to see what's happening around the coast of Antarctica. So I think we are going to have to wait. And in the meantime, we need to just reduce emissions as fast as we can.
Thank you.
Sure.
James, I'm really sorry. We're going to need to move on because we have another item. But I have a question that I'd like to ask. Could I possibly email, and I know another councillor had a question they'd like to ask as well. Could we email them through to you? Would that be okay?
That would be just fine. I'd be really happy to respond to emailed questions. Yeah, for sure.
Fabulous. And I'll circulate them around to fellow councillors after that. That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much for your time and for your presentation. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you all.
Kia ora.
Okay, kia ora.
So, I'll put the motion that we receive that presentation, and there's the recommendations in the report, which I'll take as read. So do I have a mover? So this is noting the information on the transition. Hang on, where am I? So sorry, noting the information provided to the United Nations Governmental Panel on Climate Change. Sixth assessment report is significance for environment, Canterbury strategic decision making to support strong informed regional councils. So I have a
happy to move, and Liz is second.
Sorry, I've lost track of the screen as well. So there we go. So I've got a mover and a seconder. Can I have everyone who supports that say aye? In favour, say aye. Thank you. And any against? No. So that's carried. Thank you very much. So moving on to item 7.2, this is transitioning to a low emissions and climate resilient future emissions reduction plan discussion document. So Jessie Burgess will present on this with Toshi Hodleth. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Through you, Madam Chair. Take the paper as read, but I'd just like to highlight a few key points in relation to the transition to a low emissions and climate resilient future. So the purpose of this paper today is to provide information to the committee on the paper. and to inform the process of developing a submission. This is the discussion document provides an opportunity for the council to provide feedback to the Ministry for the Environment on the content of the National Emissions Reduction Plan, which is due to be released in May 2022. The National Emissions Reduction Plan, as we've discussed today, will describe how New Zealand will meet its emissions budgets and make progress towards reaching the national 2050 net zero carbon emissions target. And the paper outlines the challenges that we face in that regard. Under the Climate Change Response Act, the government's required to release it, was required to release the final decision by December 2021. But that has been delayed, as I said, through till May next year. And the timeline change is being amended through the COVID-19 response management measures legislation bill, which is soon to receive its royal assent. The emission reduction plan will apply retrospectively from 1 January 2022 and won't be consulted on. The submission on the emissions reduction plan today, the discussion document, is the only direct opportunity that the council has to influence the final plan, and therefore a significant opportunity to ensure the needs of Canterbury are represented. An emissions budget is a total quantity of emissions that's allowed to be released during an emissions budget period. Each emissions budget period covers a period of 5 years, except the first emissions budget covered the period of 2022 to 2025. Emissions budgets will act as stepping stones or interim targets to reaching the national 2050 net zero carbon emissions targets. The National Emissions Reduction Plan will be based on the Climate Change Commission's final report, and this was delivered to the government earlier this year. Council made a submission on that, and that outlined the emissions reductions required to meet New Zealand's national and international goals and the policy direction required to achieve these in the National Emissions Reduction Plan. We did successfully submit on the advice report, and previous submission points are reflected in the submission. The discussion document does focus on the first budget period, 2022 to 2025, and particularly on the proposed targets and actions for the transport, energy and industry sectors. The document also includes waste, forestry and agriculture sector targets. Explicit attention is given to the transport and energy sectors, as these are seen as the areas for early wins. The transport section of the discussion document reflects the policy work in the Hikina Transport Emissions Pathway to Net Zero by 2050 Green Paper. I know the Regional Transport Committee and the Mayoral Forum previously made a joint submission on that paper, and the Regional Transport Committee on its meeting on the 18th of November will also be considering the transport-related points to this submission. The section on agriculture in the discussion document is limited, as the policy work on this is still being undertaken by the Secretariat for He Waka Eka Noa Primary Sector Climate Action Partnership. Although it's not indicated in the emissions reduction plan, staff are expected there will be a separate consultation on the He Waka Eka Noa policy proposals. The discussion document indicates that further consultations and decisions are likely to occur over the next year, particularly on waste, the emissions trading scheme, and we've got significant resource management system reform underway as well. So the consultation period for this closes on the 24th of November. The Ministry for the Environment has agreed to accept our submission on the 25th, noting that this submission will come to Council on that date. And as you know, we've previously discussed, we had a workshop with a number of councillors on the emissions reduction plan, and also councillors have been circulated a table which has included the key submission points for feedback. We've got the feedback from a number of councillors around the table, and that's been addressed in developing the submission. So the opportunity today really is to add anything further, comments, views, answer any questions. I've got Toshi here in terms of some of the more technical components of the discussion document, and I've also got Alina Topler and Kate Williman in my team, who both were instrumental in writing the submission. So Yeah, as I said, this will inform the national emissions reduction plan budgets that come out in May next year, and we'll be able to report back on that in due course. So happy to take any questions through you, Madam Chair, and noting the people online and also Tosha here in the room with me.
I have a couple of questions for clarity, if that's all right. Councillor Scott has a question as well. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Chair. Just in terms of this, and either of you could answer this, but in terms of lining ourselves up across the Merrill Forum, across RTC and across this climate change committee, how are we going with that in terms of Canterbury, if you like?
Yes. So through you, Madam Chair, we're working as part of the climate change working group through the Merrill Forum is preparing a submission and working with the Regional Transport Committee with the Transport Officers Group, and in particular around the transport elements of the submission, and developing that with our project steering group through the working group through the Merrill Forum. Reflecting a lot of what's in this submission through that broader Merrill Forum and RTC joint submission. The Greater Christchurch Partnership has also agreed to make a submission. They delegated that decision to the mayors and chairs through GCP at their meeting last Friday. So that submission is being prepared off the back of what we've been developing here as well.
Just on that, so I mean, my point with this is there's a lot of moving bits in here from Canterbury's perspective, and there's a lot of really good work gone into this too, because I mean, I've thought about it really fully, and so the hierarchy, I guess, in terms of how we get to where we get to, it's like Merrill Forum, this committee, GCP, RTC. Is there a hierarchy of like who's got the most votes here? Cheers.
I'm not sure it's really a hierarchy issue as such. It's more about reflecting the points, submission points that are relative to the region or the sub-region. So in particular, transport and public transport emissions reduction targets around that would be far more pertinent to a sub-regional area like Greater Christchurch with a significant urban population. And some of the other aspects of the submission would be more of a broader Canterbury space. So we're trying to integrate all of the thoughts across all of those different fora and I guess, you know, look at the different issues at the different in the different spaces, but it is a collective effort.
I'm just really keen on the fact that we don't get to next Thursday with RTC and the Merrill Forum going on from there, and we don't start criticising the good work that's been done, or you know, going at angles to it. So I mean, that's my only concern there, that we are lined up. Thank you.
I've just put my two questions of clarity, and then there are some more councillors. I am aware we also have a workshop starting at 12:30, so we're really tight for time, and there's probably some conversation wanted too. Just for clarity, and it might be that you send this back through email, but I'm interested in understanding we've got 66% of Canterbury's emissions are agricultural sector in terms of CO2 equivalent, and I'm just wondering what proportion of that, or is in that figure, is that the likes of the emissions from the coal burners and the processing and the transportation of primary produce as well? Is that all within that 66%, or does some of that land up in the energy sector and in the transport sector? How does that work?
Kia ora, through you, Madam Chair. As with any statistics, there is, you know, international norms for how they are done, which may be different from a national approach to emissions reduction. In this situation, we have Statistics New Zealand using an international statistics framework, which defines industries in particular ways. And you are correct that agriculture in the Statistics New Zealand statistics of the 66% includes essentially the end-to-end of the entirety of the agricultural sector, in a broad definition under an Australia-New Zealand standard of what the agricultural sector is. That is distinct from the emissions reduction plan, which separates agriculture into specifically the on-farm activities around biogenic methane primarily.
So leading on from that, it would be really helpful, and I note also that freight is identified in the report as 25% of the national emissions, and I'd be really interested to know what our freight emissions are as a percentage of Canterbury's emissions. So really just trying to understand where are the clear, significant, outside of the the methane and the like, which I know is tricky, and that's Hiwaka Noa is looking at that. In terms of the carbon emissions that are related to our primary sector and all the other manufacturing and other things we do, like where are the big chunks of carbon footprint, the fossil fuel carbon footprint, which is our transport, which is process heat, etc. So that would be useful information to receive. So Councillor Clearwater, you have a question?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to staff for all of the information, the work that's been done. It's huge. But I just want to ask a question, and like one of the some of the, for example, on page 125, there's a good table around and including the budgets. For example, in this case, it was transport, and delineating some years when we might aim to achieve those things. But I just wondered, besides what's written there, has there been some work done on the costings to actually achieve those budgets, either, or I'm guessing starting at the national level?
The Climate Change Commission has done some work on that. It is in development, and it is a maturing kind of science. It is that challenge of, if you're focusing on reducing emissions over here, to work out the total cost of impact and the comparison between the cost of a reduction here versus saving over there can be a very challenging thing. It's one of the feedbacks that we, with your support and in drafting the submission, wish to make suggestions around how business cases are developed and what expectation is on us as local government and on others when they do business cases, particularly to feed into central government models, and how things like ecosystem services and emissions reductions are factored in as part of those business cases, because as we all know, they follow at the current time quite standard systems around money and its current cost and its value over time, and insufficiently allow for the type of multi-criteria analysis and the changes in emissions pricing which we may see over time.
Councillor Farm.
Yeah, thanks. Just a few things that have come up today which have actually been touched on in the submissions, but just want to emphasise them. I think particularly around the clarity of local government's role. Like, I just don't think we can be, bang that drum enough in our submission. And, Professor Renwick pointed that out really clearly. I think also domestic action instead of international is a no-brainer. But specifically, and it's interesting hearing that the coal aspects would come under that 66% of agriculture, because I think there is a real opportunity, like that clearly is the opportunity in terms of quick wins within the agricultural sector, and that would be a really good news story. So I would like us to specifically be putting in, acknowledging that 7.7 million tonne gap and saying that one way to plug that, or 1 million tonnes or whatever it is that zero coal Canterbury suggestion. And it's going to be high level. It's just some numbers. It's been a suggestion that's been put forward, but I think that's exactly what the government are actually asking for. And I think we should just take that and run with it. And I'd like to see that. Thanks.
Yeah, tautoko from me. Councillor Mackenzie, Elizabeth Mackenzie online. We're going to needing to keep it quite tight now because we also were hoping, I think, have a bit of discussion, but we might have to do that.
Okay, thanks. I just want to quickly support Lan's comments. Have we emphasised the area of process heat in our submission and the possibility of government co-funding a zero coal Canterbury plan? Also, a couple of other quick points. Have we made the point strongly that the plan relies too much on electric vehicles? And also, do we make the point that we shouldn't rely on purchasing large amounts of carbon credits to offset our emissions? Have we highlighted the risk to a circular economy of importing biomass, oil, coal, etc.? And finally, do we make the point in our submission that we need to reduce our offshore emissions from international freight, air and sea freight? So that's just quickly the sort of things that I sort of think we should just check whether that we've got those in there. Thank you.
So Claire, shall I move the motion that we receive the information and then we'll go do discussion, which I think is the the right way. So yeah, so put the motion that is in the paper. I won't read it out, but have I got a mover for that? So Councillor Farm and a seconder, please. Yes, Councillor to retire Cranwell. We can have seconders from to retire in these meetings. It's a committee. That's brilliant. So then, do we have discussion? Opportunity for discussion. So Claire, Councillor Mackay. Yes.
Yeah, look, it's been quite interesting listening to the deputations. What were they this morning? Public forum speakers this morning, and just the reflection on the ICCP stuff. And I think that's really just important to remember, and I'm talking nationally here, around agriculture's impact on biogenic methane. The actual total 42% does not equal 42% warming. So for me, it's around making sure that we don't consider emissions as the same thing as warming. And I noticed James Renwick spoke a lot about warming. And I think that's the important thing. That's the outcome that we're trying to actually keep under control. So for me, I'd like to actually encourage the government to progress and show some more leadership on the split gas approach, which actually they've accepted, and building that understanding across not only Canterbury but nationally as well, because each gas does have different warming impacts. And I think that's really important. So that would look at something like some more work and some interpretation and some leadership around the GWP star, which is consistent actually with the latest IPCC report. I think the other thing I'd love to see, and I've certainly provided it in my feedback, and I think Councillor Sunkel did as well, was encouraging central government to release or allow new technology to be used. I mean, we've got technology that's already licensed in overseas countries that will reduce, for example, biogenic methane from our animals, but it's not actually available in New Zealand at the moment. It's still very much in the trial space, but same ingredients and being used overseas. And I think it's just important to remember a couple of other points, is that we're the only country globally that's got livestock emissions actually loaded in some sort of abatement scheme, as I understand it, along the sort of understanding of the ETS carbon units, and also the work that came out from the global company KPMG on the Net Zero Readiness Index, which rated New Zealand as a world leader in the agricultural emissions reduction program. So I think that those are some things that nationally, which this submission is, we should actually be noting.
Okay, thank you. Do I have any other comments at this point? I will just note that we have got a mechanism for putting our thoughts through to staff up until Monday, and then this will come back to full council on the 25th of November. Sorry, Councillor Clearwater.
Just Vicky and to staff, one of the points that I took from James's presentation that was most concerning really was around when he made a comment around government's policies not really being joined up to focus on climate change. And I think that it would be really important to ask them to address that.
That's lovely. So I'll just take, we've had a mover and a seconder of the recommendations. So can I just have all those who are in favour say aye? And those against? That's being no one, that's carried. So then item 7.3, we do have a workshop starting in 4 minutes. So I'm going to take this one as read. And again, if there's specific questions from the paper, perhaps we could put questions through to staff and then we'll bring that back to another meeting. So do I need to move the most? Yes, so I'll just ask for a mover of the recommendation that we receive the update on the Climate Change Resilience Work Programme. So Councillor Clearwater, Councillor Scott to second, thank you very much. So all those in favour, please say aye. Those against? No one, so that's carried, thank you very much. So I'm going to just gallop through the remainder here now. So we've got no notice of motion. I don't believe there's any extraordinary urgent business. The next meeting will be in 2022, hopefully sooner than later. Don't have an actual date yet, so that'll be notified on our website in due course. Timothy Cranwell, are you galloped through to the closing? Okay, so we'll do the closing karakia at the end of the workshop that's coming up. So for the public meeting, we're now closed, and the time is 12:28. Kia ora, thank you very much.